exploding in 1989 throughout 1990 and for the 14 years. The first component I've talked about is the Liberians who had fled the country and felt that the only way they were going to return is to move, though, by the force of violence. Then you had the countries that facilitated their action. First was the Ivory Coast. Dwanyen was a close friend of Talbot. His son, Avi Talbot, Talbot's son was married to the daughter of Hofwe, and he resented the fact that Doe would kill his friend and his son-in-law. The daughter that was married to Avi Talbot subsequently married Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso. But before that, Blaise Compaoré was the number 2 to Thomas Sankara. And the information that I have is Charles Taylor, when during their training, facilitated the killing of Thomas Sankara with his men. And so Blaise now had this loyalty to Taylor. Then comes in Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi and Doe had this rivalry where Gaddafi was trying to expand his influence in Africa, and Doe was the American ally, resisting Gaddafi very forcefully. As talked at an OAU conference, they almost came to blows. Now, Muammar Gaddafi had a plan to create a union of Arab states where he would be the overlord. The United States was able to rebuff that using their influence with moderate Arab states like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Egypt. And so Gaddafi felt like he had to continue this fight with America. And so since he could not bring the fight to America's shores, Liberia became the proxy ground for this fight. And so Gaddafi provided the financing and the training base in Libya for the Taylor Group. I've heard stories that Prince Johnson was actually in Libya before Taylor brought his men, and so Prince never really felt that Taylor was his boss, which explains how they eventually wound up splitting up. So they trained in Libya, and their transit point of arms and men was from Libya through Burkina Faso to the Ivory Coast. And they started this war by launching cross-border hit and run raids. They would hit in Liberia and run back into the Ivory Coast and receive sanctuary. And rather than the Liberian army fighting the rebels, they began to systematically, again, target the people of Nimba County. That created a huge wave of refugees across the border. They would go into the towns, just shoot indiscriminately. They would tie people up in a house and burn them to death. And those who escaped were deeply angry, and it provided a breeding ground for recruits for the NPFL. And I believe that Taylor did this deliberately and diabolically, knowing fully well that if he did anything in Nimba County, Doe was going to go in to burn the ground. And so they carried this out, and unfortunately, we've seen the damage that was done to the country. During the war, I don't know any Liberian that didn't lose family members. I had a cousin, Peter Langer, who was at the Lutheran Church, among those who were massacred. My own father was killed by Charles Taylor, and an uncle, Robert Dwanyen, who was killed by the government soldiers in Bound. The NPFL looted substantial property from us. My father was in the rubber business, and at the time they had a stockpile of rubber that was valued about $60,000 or so. They looted that and sold it to LAC. They looted his Pajero Jeep. They looted a Peugeot 504. They looted a Toyota truck that was used on the farm for, for transporting the rubber. And they looted, the equipment that they had in the logging business. But the assassination of my father was no accident. In June of 1990, I got a call from my uncle who's in Detroit, Nathaniel Wayne. He said, if you know where your father is, tell him not to go near Charles Taylor. They had received a hit list that somebody smuggled out that had a listing of people that Charles Taylor wanted dead. My father was on that list. And everybody whose name was on that list, the only ones that survived were those who did not enter Charles Taylor's territory. Gabriel Colette was on that list. Jackson Doe was on that list. Dr. Stephen Yeckerson was on that list. David Toy, my uncle, was on that list. The other day, Sheikh Afoma called and we were talking, and he was narrating, some of what had happened in Banjul in I believe that was the September conference that elected the interim government. The reason Taylor wanted these people dead was because he didn't want to compete against the political capital. And others have shared this with me, that my father, along with Jackson Doe, at the time that there was a search for an interim president, when they decided that they were going to have this interim governance arrangement that would lead the country for 1 year, disarm everybody and go to elections, he was on the short list to be selected as president. And everybody said, well, it's not a wise thing to do because all these people are in Taylor's held territory. If you select them and announce their names, they will be killed. But by the time that discussion was going on, they had already been killed. The incident of his attack was relayed to me by James Zota, who's now a judge in Liberia. Zota then was the Minister of State in the Taylor government, the NPRAG, as they called it. My father had left his home because it had been overrun by the war, and he was among the 17,000 people displaced at the Omega Towers. The general manager for Omega was a good friend of his, and he had given him his office that was his living quarters. So this day was July 6, 1990. This group of soldiers came in. The death squad soldier called Border Patrol, I'm sure you've heard this name before. He also goes by the name Mendin, was the one who led the people that came in. They didn't know him personally, so they asked, is David Dwanyen here? Then he came outside. And as soon as he came outside, they pounced on him and started to attack him with their gun butts. And James Zota immediately, when he saw what was happening, he rushed in there and told them, and screamed at them, and they left. But he had to leave. When he left, they came back. And again, somebody intervened, and they left. So my father was taken to Bon Mines Hospital. While at Bon Mines Hospital, this very Border Patrol led another group of soldiers who came in and demanded that he and two other prisoners, I forget the name of, two other prominent patients, be taken out of the hospital. This was narrated to me by O'Brien Yima, who lives here in Minnesota. And according to O'Brien, the chief medical officer at the clinic was so upset, he said, if you take any patients from here, I will stop treating you guys. And so he drove off, and as a result, when they brought their wounded soldiers, he refused to go and treat them. So his killing was not accidental. It was a targeted assassination to eliminate people that Taylor considered political competition. My father had built a very strong reputation in the country, being a leader that advocated the aspirations of the Liberian people. Before the 1985 elections, he was approached by many of the political parties to be the standard bearer. He thought that the military was not serious about elections and he was not prepared to put his family through the turmoil, so he did not. And so that's what happened to him. I was able to evacuate my mother and my younger siblings out of the country and brought them out to safety. We followed the various peace accords with a lot of hope and anticipation. We all felt that the leadership of our country should not be rewarded to somebody because they have the biggest gun. Should be awarded to them because they won the mandate of the people through the ballot box. Taylor signed on to all of these agreements, but systematically broke them just as he signed them. The first agreements were done in Banjul. He claimed that he didn't trust President Dawda Jawara, so he didn't attend those conferences. So they decided to move the conferences to the Ivory Coast, to the home of his godfather. And there were 4 conferences held in Yamoussoukro. All 4 of those agreements, which he signed on to, had the same theme: disarm, demobilize, have an interim government that will be headed by no leader of a warring faction, and then you go to elections. He would sign on and then back away from it. In late 1992, there began to be whispers and rumors that Taylor was planning to attack Monrovia. It seemed quite absurd given that we had a peacekeeping contingent that had, at the time, I think 10,000 soldiers. Many of those countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Guinea, Senegal, Liberia, cannot militarily defeat single-hand, alone. So imagine that 7 of them are here, and there's this talk that Taylor is going to attack them. It didn't make sense. But I guess a lot of things that happened in this war didn't make sense either. And so I had returned to Monrovia by that time I was doing business in the country, bringing cars, bringing, toiletries and clothing and other commodities. I had arrived in Monrovia on October 14th, brought in a container. The very morning where I woke to the sound of artillery fire, loud explosions coming from Mount Barclay. And that was Operation Octopus. It shattered a lot of hopes. By then, before Octopus, the Liberian currency had, used to trade before the war at 2.3 to 1. Prior, between 1990 and Octopus, it was trading at 7 to 1. Times were hard, but people were still managing somewhat to make it. The following morning of Octopus, that currency went from 7 to 1 versus the US dollar to 50 to 1. That was an overnight 85% depreciation of the wealth of people that were already struggling. And the hardships were extreme. And there was a lot of killing on the outskirts of the city as the rebels had penetrated through Caldwell. There was this plot between Taylor and Prince Johnson. Prince Johnson thought that he would invite Taylor to Caldwell and then capture him. He failed to realize that the whole world saw him play that same trick with Dole, and it wasn't possible for Taylor to fall in that trap. But anyway, he had thousands of Taylor's men in the Caldwell base, and they eventually overran him and did a lot of damage in the Caldwell, Garnersville, Barnesville area. And so this was October. By December, I was in my store and I got an invitation from Joseph Dwanyen, who was then Minister of State for Presidential Affairs. And we went into a meeting. They invited me to a meeting in the Ducourt. And Dwanyen, Tiawan Gonglo, Johnson Guayclo, Yasso White Dahlia, Harry Yorn, Johnson, Joseph Danquan, and most of the Nimba leaders who were in the interim government were in that meeting. And Dwanyen said, listen, ECOMOG has a plan to launch an attack on Taylor from the border with Guinea, to attack him in the rear and cut off his supply routes. And they would prefer that we help them so that they don't meet resistance that would be devastating to lives and property, that we can mitigate the damages if Nimba people can help them to do two things. One, provide them with scouts who knew the terrain, who could help them fight. Two, create an information campaign to persuade the people of Nimba that ECOMOG is a friendly force, not a hostile force. Don't resist them. I'll go back to the 1990s when Taylor first resisted the deployment of ECOMOG. President Bamangida gave the command that they should drive him to the border drive him to Harper. And so they began that offensive, and then Taylor began this propaganda that they were killing civilians. The air raids were bombing civilians. And so Sawyer got on the air and said to ECOMOG, stop the bombing. And that undermined ECOMOG's ability to pursue Taylor, so they stopped. That was the biggest tactical mistake by Sawyer. I've spoken to people who were, for example, in Bombing Hills. Pee Wee Reed is in this community. And he said, listen, all those bodies, NPFL soldiers did not wear uniforms. And at the time, no civilians were allowed to own cars. They even looted cars from the UN and non-governmental organizations. So any truckloads of cars that were going were typically NPFL soldiers going to the war front. Civilians were not in trucks in mass heading towards Monrovia. If they were in trucks, they were heading away from Monrovia. So if a truckload of people was coming towards Monrovia, it was NPFL soldiers. And when they would display the bodies, they would remove the weapons and display the bodies, and they would be wearing jeans and civilian clothes that say they're killing civilians. But what Pee Wee Reed also said to me is that bombing in all those areas, all these soldiers, when the air raids were going on, they said, listen, we're done, we're out of here. So had that continued, the NPFL would have been defeated in a matter of weeks, if not a few months. And Sawyer realized that he had made this tactical mistake once. He realized that Taylor was not negotiating in good faith and launched Operation Octopus. So the idea of the Nimba Redemption Council was sort of reawakening this policy, going from, at first from peacekeeping. They arrived as peacekeepers, they went to peace enforcement, then they went back to peacekeepers, and now they were going back into peace enforcement. So we discussed the idea, and it was basically, listen, we're going to do this. If you help us, it will be better for all parties. And many of us deeply resented what was happening in the country with Taylor. And we had come to the resolve that the only language that he was going to understand was, was military action. So we supported the action that ECOMOG was contemplating, and we, resolved to support them. I was asked to be the political spokesman for the project, to, travel around different capitals to persuade countries who may have not fully understood that this is necessary, to also persuade the people of Nimba County that please support ECOMOG, allow this deployment, this is good for the country, abandon Charles Taylor. And so we drafted, Dwanyen drafted a statement, a position statement, a release that I was going to circulate at the onset of the ECOMOG deployment. Him and I left Monrovia in January of 1993. We traveled to the Ivory Coast and met with the liaison. At the time, there were probably 3,000 to 5,000 young men who had previously fought for Taylor but became disaffected and left him and just was straddling the border between the Ivory Coast and Guinea, the Liberian Ivory Coast Guinea border. And many of them wanted to return. They knew they couldn't return, and they were anxious to, to be a part of this. So we met with their leaders in the Ivory Coast, and I left Dwanyen there. This was something that was basically run from the Ministry of State. And, Dwanyen called the shots. I left him there and came to the States. And I had meetings with people in various Nimba communities here, the State Department, and things like that. But before, the meetings were after, there were some meetings that were not public, prior to the launching of the effort. It wasn't public. So we were expecting the troops to be deployed to the Guinea border. At the time, the satellite that was providing telephone service to Monrovia got destroyed during Octopus. So there was a special satellite hookup that was brought to Telecom that was providing telephone service from, I believe, Ducor and the Mansion, and Telecom in a few places. It was quite difficult to communicate by phone to Liberia then. When I was calling from here, it was costing something like $15 per minute, and you could barely get through. Yasuo Dollier went to Guinea to be a part of the staging, but him and I could not communicate. He called me once, but the telephone connection was very poor. We had very little communication, but what I did gather from him was that they were waiting for the ECOMOG troops to be positioned. And so I kept waiting, and I kept asking, what's going on? When are they going to get there? When they get there, then let me know. The idea was that we would circulate the statements coinciding with their deployment. So on one morning, I got a call from Harrion to say, listen, the ECOMOG troops are in position. There are 3 battalions there, and you need to release a statement. Prior to that, I thought Harrion walked on water. I had no reason to dispute anything that he said. So I released a statement and went on the BBC, announcing the Nimba Redemption Council and calling and supporting the deployment, calling for and supporting the deployment of ECOMOG. And that statement went out. I gave a few interviews. I traveled the country, and then left, and I flew to Nigeria and traveled across various capitals in West Africa, carrying out the diplomatic portion of what I was expected to do. It turned out that the ECOMOG soldiers were not in place. It turned out that Nigeria had borne too heavy a burden. And we found all of these out way after the fact, that Nigeria had borne a heavy burden for the ECOMOG effort in Liberia. And in order for them to deploy the troops, they would have to move a lot of conventional weapons, tanks, artillery, from Conakry to Zerikore, which I believe is about 600 to 700 miles. And the road was largely unpaved, very, not so friendly, terrain. So they made a decision against it, that they were not prepared to commit those resources. What I've also found out is that Sawyer and Guanu and Harry Yarn then prevailed upon ECOWAS and said, ecomog and said,